This is the Reluctant Leader podcast, the podcast designed to help you if you've landed a leadership role through no fault of your own and now need to find out what you should be doing. I'm your host, Mark Terrell, and have been there and know what it feels like and made all the mistakes. In each episode, I'll be getting to grips with a leadership topic by interviewing an expert in their field. You'll find out why they do what they do and take away some top tips you can use to become a more confident leader. For more content and to keep in touch with how the project is developing, go to www.thereluctantleader.co.uk. If you have any comments about the episode, you'll find me on LinkedIn, Facebook and Twitter. So let's crack on with the show. Today I'm talking to Russ Haworth. Russ is a family business consultant and financial planner. He helps families to navigate the complexities that come from being in business together. He is also the host of the Family Business Podcast. I hope you enjoy this chat we had about working with family, and I'll catch you all on the other side. Russ, welcome to the Reluctant Leader Podcast.
Hi, Mark. Thanks for having me on.
We've had chats in the past on your own podcast, which is the Family Business Podcast, and I thought it's only right that you come on my podcast, which for many reasons, and one being that you are part of the inspiration to start this podcast.
Thank you.
But before we get stuck into the topic and we begin talking about working with family, just tell us why you took this path. What was the pivotal moment that started you down this path?
Sure. So my background is in financial planning, and I was typically in the financial planning department of large national or regional accountancy practices. So as a result of that, my typical client would be a family business. Now, it wasn't something that I was deliberately focusing on. It was just the nature of, nearly 90% of businesses are family-owned businesses. And therefore, as a result of that, it meant that I was typically working with them around their succession planning and around their financial and emotional freedom from the business. When I moved to my current company, I decided that I would, rightly or wrongly, write a book about some of the challenges that are faced, particularly at succession planning. And I put a sort of general shout out on LinkedIn saying, I'm putting this book together. I'd love for people to get involved and help me with the research and the interviews. And that led me to speaking to several accountants, lawyers, family business members, and in particular a chap called John Tucker, who is a family business consultant. And I recorded all of the interviews that I had with these individuals so that I could get the interviews transcribed, and then that would form the basis of the book around my own thoughts on certain aspects and certain subjects, which I'm sure we'll get into a bit later on as well. But one particular chat stood out, which was the one with John. Now, normally everyone else I sort of sat down and spoke with, we did an hour to an hour and a half. John and I sat in a cafe in Bristol for 5.5 hours, and we just kind of hit it off. And he kind of opened my eyes to a different way of tackling issues within a family-owned business. I'd been coming at it very much from a financial planning perspective, but more recently, so over the last 4 or 5 years, I've now moved to being able to offer full family business consultancy services to the family businesses that I work with, as well as the financial planning side. And it was really John's kind of inspiration, if you like, in that chat in a cafe in Bristol. The cafe must have been really annoyed with us because I think we only had 1 or 2 coffees. We were there for 5.5 hours. But the viewpoint that he was able to offer and the way in which he helps family businesses really shaped a pivot in my own career. So I then went and discovered the Family Firm Institute and took their advanced certificate in family business advising. The recordings of the interviews actually became the inspiration for the podcast, because the book is still yet to be published. It's sat here waiting. I just need to hit print or publish or whatever the technical term is for publishing the book. But the interviews themselves became the basis of the podcast because, in my view, you can get a far wider reach via the podcast than you can through a book that's probably going to sell 30 copies, most of those to your family.
Right. Excellent. And I think most people that have been listening to this podcast and know me know that I come from a family retail business. And so I've had sort of first-hand experience of working with my parents, with my brothers, with my daughters, nephews, and all that goes with it. So I've been there and know a bit about it. But I, to be honest, I've never really gone into the detail that I see you talking about, Russ. And I think that one of the problems that I think we had going back was that we were a bit too insular, in that we were like a compact unit. We ran this business. It was, we sort of lived it, breathed it. And any outside influence was seen as probably, maybe not wanted or maybe just, we didn't want that influence maybe. And so how does that work? How do you get across that? Because I'm sure that's quite common within family businesses, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, the first thing to say is that it is very, very common. It is something that we come up against very often. The thing with family businesses is that every single one of them is unique, because they are the only business with those particular family members in it. And that can be one of the reasons behind why there is this sort of insular view, is nobody else has to work with my dad, my mum, my brother, my nephew, whatever the particular character is. And whilst that might be true, the challenges and issues that family businesses can face are much more widespread. They're much more common across every different family business. So the phrase I like to use when I explain this is that family businesses are collectively unique. So they are individual characters, but the challenges that those individual characters can present are very, very common within family businesses. And I think that's part of the message to get across, is that very often when we first speak to family businesses, they feel isolated, they feel alone. And they think that they're the only people that are going through this particular struggle. And the truth of the matter is that they're not, and that there is help out there to be able to help them navigate that. Because let's not forget, being in business with your family can be hugely rewarding. It's a fantastic thing to do. You have a shared value set. You have a shared goal. You have a common ethical thread through your family that, if you can put that into a business, is fantastic. It's a brilliant way of impacting on the community, impacting on the family itself. But there is, as well as there being sort of a higher propensity for love within a family business, there's also a higher propensity for hate, because you can probably get away with things in a boardroom meeting with your family that you wouldn't necessarily be able to get away with in a non-family business. So, we've been in boardroom meetings where, people have been swearing at each other and, threatening each other, and all sorts of that dynamic that you just wouldn't necessarily get within a non-family workplace. And it's the management of those emotions that can become very challenging, shall we say. To overcome those, it can be a slow process. Part of the way in which we work with people is to slow that process down, to get them to understand that actually there's a different dynamic happening here to what's maybe your peers are struggling with in a corporate environment or a non-family environment, and that you're not alone, and we can help. And
that's all so relevant and important to understand that those every family business is different, but they have similarities. But I think it's worth just because I've come across lots of people, and there was a time when I was sort of saying that I was a family business coach because of my background, and that's sort of, I felt that that's where I could help. But obviously moved on more to the reluctant leader stuff. But when I come to talk to people about family businesses, there was a very much almost like a bipolar, in that people said, "Oh, I bet that's really interesting," and then there's other people said, "You wouldn't catch me going there with a barge pole," and it was really, really, there was no middle ground. It was just, "Oh, that sounds really interesting," and that's, I suppose that's depends on your experience, doesn't it? It all depends on what you've come across in the past. If you've had a bad experience, then you're going to be that, "Oh, I'm not going there again." Or if you've come across a family business that are, that doing well and they've got a great culture around them, then you just want to do more of that, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as well, from a personal perspective, I love working with family businesses. So the dynamic that is created by working with your family is something that endlessly fascinates me in terms of, if I have a bad day, for example, I can go home to my wife and say that this has happened and I've had a terrible day, or I can ring my parents up and go, well, this happened and my bosses are, you know what. But when they are your family and you are working with them, it becomes so much harder to do. And that dynamic fascinates me. And I think where the kind of passion comes from it is that there is ways in which that can be helped. There is a phrase which I don't like personally, but it's a term called professionalizing the family business, which can be met with some reluctance. It can be seen as a break on behavior, i.e. someone's going to come in and tell me that I've been doing this wrong for all these years and nobody will understand what our family stands for. It can also impact on recruitment in terms of people not understanding the family ethos. And the common phrase is they don't get it. And you ask them, well, what is it? And they go, well, it. And it's all these things, all these elements that come into it that I find hugely fascinating. And I'm fortunate enough to be in a position to be able to help people overcome those challenges, which again is why, for me, it's the fascinating end rather than I wouldn't touch it with a barge pole end. I kind of have that view over the more corporate entities where, there isn't this interesting dynamic going on. I think it's far more straightforward within that, and I might be doing that a disservice, but it's far more straightforward at that end than it is at the family-owned end.
Yeah. And as we are, this is a podcast which is based on leadership. And I suppose that's where it all begins, isn't it? That where is the leadership within the business, and who is taking the lead? I know early days in our family business, my dad was very much that, leader. He had come from a corporate background and wanted to create his own retail sort of business from the things that he'd learned. And he was leading that because he had the experience and we were sort of fresh out of school and all those sort of things. And we had to be led. And, to be honest, he led us, in a really a positive way and, passed on a lot of the knowledge to us. But I suppose it's when the time comes where that leadership has to be passed down, I suppose that's one of the biggest challenges that family businesses have.
It is. And if you imagine, so your dad sounds as if he was quite entrepreneurial. He had a passion. He had a vision that he wanted to follow. And when that's your passion and your vision, it's relatively easy to be able to articulate that because it's yours. If you then think about the succession planning to the next generation, irrespective of how strong a leadership there is within that business, part of that passion is going to be diluted because the circumstances within which you've grown up will be entirely different to the circumstances around which your dad grew up in, for example. So you can't help but lose some of that passion or have it diluted somewhat. And it might manifest itself in a different passion. And that's where you think, well, actually, I want to take this business that Dad's created and take it in a slightly different direction. And that in itself can create a challenge because you're trying to do something that follows your passion and it doesn't quite align with what's gone before. And then if you take that into a third generation, for example, that dilution happens further. And so there's a well-worn phrase in family business, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. And I think a lot of that is around the type of leadership that can be present within a family-owned business, is that there is an assumption that everybody shares the same passion and shares the same belief because you're from the same family. But the reality is the communication around that needs to happen and be something that is constantly evolving so that everybody is on the same page and everybody shares that longer term view and vision for the business. Because if you can unite around that, the power of family and business around a united goal can be hugely powerful and hugely rewarding.
Yeah, and that is the challenge, isn't it? It's passing that vision down the line, and you absolutely summed it up perfectly. There is it's bound to get diluted, but it then comes to a point where you have to sort of blend the two generational visions, don't you? And get something in place to encourage that. And I suppose that is, you've already just mentioned the C word, that communication thing, which I'm sure we're going to mention again. And it's about having an opportunity to communicate in a way where it's constructive, bring people together, allow everybody to have their view, and there's no right or wrong situation, so that they can actually come up with a plan that sort of fits everybody's sort of desires and values and vision, really, isn't it?
And I think that's a really important point, is making sure everybody's expectations are understood and managed, because it may be that you're in the next generation of a family business and your aspirations are to take over by a certain point. And that might not match with the senior generation. It might not match with other people in the next generation. It might not even match with the third or fourth generation in that scenario, where if your expectations aren't talked about and aren't managed in a safe environment, then that's where little niggles can start to appear, and you can start getting underlying frustration within individuals within the business, which then permeates around the business itself and can be quite toxic. But having those conversations and chats around succession at an early point, where everybody's expectations are laid on the table in a very open and honest way. It sounds really easy, but it can be quite difficult to be honest with your family, because you might be sat there going, I don't want to do this. You might be sat there going, I don't want to be the next managing director of this business just because I share the same surname as you, or just because I'm traditionally within our family business, it could be eldest son. And the pressure that can put on people when they're being pushed into that leadership role, potentially against their will, can be damaging both to them as individuals, but also to the business. And so having those conversations really early, there's I think a Japanese or Chinese proverb that says the best time to plant a tree was 25 years ago. It's broadly similar with succession planning. The best time to start was years ago. The second best time to start is now, because that discussion is not going to go away. It will be an elephant in the room. And if expectations aren't managed and people are thinking, well, I'm going to take over this business from this point, and then don't, it can cause all sorts of troubles. And actually, I think that's a really positive leadership trait, is having very good communication and being able to accept that your expectations might not be the same as the people who are working around you in the business. And particularly when that's family, to be able to create a safe space. And I'm not necessarily talking around the kitchen table. It could be in a boardroom. It could be in a retreat. It could be, if you have a particular holiday spot that you all like to go to, that you talk about these particular things. Having the ability to share and air your views in a very open and honest way can be hugely empowering to the family business.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a great time to introduce one of the models that you talk about quite a lot. And again, I wasn't aware of this model when I was in the family business, but it would have been so helpful to have sort of had this to understand, and obviously to share it and make sure everybody understood how this worked. So the 3-circle model is something that you talked about. I've seen you do, recently with a video, and I think it's an opportunity to introduce that and just talk about what that is and how family businesses can use that.
Yeah, so the 3-circle model is just over 40 years old now, but it stands the test of time. And I think it's probably the most relevant and widely used model to help explain the complexities of a family-owned business. So perhaps difficult on a podcast to draw it out. So I'm drawing it out in the air as we speak. But if you imagine 3 circles that overlap in a Venn diagram, and you've got 2 on the bottom and 1 on the top. The 2 on the bottom are management or employment and business ownership. So you've got 2 circles there that overlap. And in a non-family business, if you are an owner of the business but also work in the business, that can create complexity around which hat are you wearing when certain decisions are made. So you have a simultaneous role that exists between ownership and working within the business. If you then overlay that with another circle, the top one, which is family, you've gone from a model that had 3 segments to one that has 7 segments. So you've got potentially 7 different roles that people are playing within that organization that will have an influence over that. So you could have a family member who doesn't own the business and doesn't work in the business, but is married to somebody who does. And they will have an influence over that family business. You may have somebody who sits right in the center of that model, where they are a family member, where they own the business and they work and manage the business. And they've got to look at the complexity that exists. Where are you making that decision as mum or dad? Are you making that decision as the owner of the business for a strategic reason longer term? Or are you making that decision as somebody who works within that business? And once you start to break down those different simultaneous roles, you can start to understand where some of the frustration might be coming into the business. So it could be that you're trying to tackle a family issue by doing something with the ownership structure of the business. But by separating them out and understanding who's wearing which hat in those conversations can be really enlightening. It's like a light bulb moment for people when they go, oh God, that's a really simple way of explaining. But actually it's an exceptionally complex model. And I think that's where the beauty of it lies, because it's very easy to draw out. You draw 3 circles. You have family, you have ownership, and you have management or being employed within the business. And then plotting where people sit in each of those circles allows you to understand which hat they're wearing in those conversations.
Yes, and I think also you can then, when there is transition going on, you can also use that model to demonstrate what's happening. So if you're going from one section to another, then you can have a quick discussion about how that works. And
absolutely,
it's almost, it sort of sets it into some sort of framework that you can, you could probably name what each one of these 7 segments for want of sort of simplification, and then say, well, you're moving from A to C, and the difference is going to be this, that, and the other. And I suppose that's quite useful, isn't it? It
is very useful, and it ties in with. I've actually created my own 3-circle model as well. So again, same Venn diagram. The bottom 2 circles are financial and technical, and if you imagine the typical advice that a family business will receive around a particular issue, they will generally fall into one of those camps or both. So financial in terms of tax structuring, in terms of financial planning, in terms of accountancy advice, or you've got technical, which is the more legal aspect. And sometimes they overlap, and that brings complexity. But that's based on logic, and it's based on textbook. The 3rd circle that I overlay on that model is the emotional element of that. And when emotion meets logic, generally it can create challenges. And so family businesses and family business leaders who may be listening to that also need to be able to articulate the emotional aspects that are going on. And if you start drawing those arrows, as you say, from somebody on a succession discussion, for example, who is moving from ownership and family and working in the business to perhaps, and I say this in inverted commas, just being in the family, their sense of purpose, their sense of identity is under threat. And so when somebody comes in and goes, well, you need to do this, this, and this because the tax reasons are this and the legal aspects are that, if that emotional aspect's not being understood, that person is going to resist against those changes. And so again, as part of the sort of positive leadership that can be shown within a family business, understanding those roles and understanding who sits where and who wears what hat, and then overlay that with the advice you're being given through the emotional lens, it can really help to open up the discussions and tackle the issues that generally don't fit within a financial or technical aspect. That the other challenge is lawyers, accountants, financial planners, for example, are not economically motivated to solve emotional issues. They're there to solve the logical issues. But the emotional issues do not go away.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think, is one of the biggest challenges of being within a family business, is typically the advice that a lot of textbook advisors give, and this is not just disparaging against them at all, because that's their role. It's too logical. If there is such a thing as being too logical, it just doesn't account for the emotional aspect that can exist within a family business.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you talk about emotion within a business, it's some people just will say things like, well, you've got to keep the emotion out of the business. But you can say one thing, but actually we all come to work with emotions, and in a a non-family business scenario, it's important. But within the family business scenario, it's even more important, because that's that extra complexity that, and hopefully, if you're working with your family, you want to get on with them. You want to create something that's going to cut longevity, and I guess that's one of the things that family businesses are generally quite good at. It's having a long range view, isn't it? And you don't want something that is emotionally based to disrupt that. And if you've got a handle on it, it's obviously you can prevent coming off the rails.
Yeah, that obviously is a very big advantage of being in a family-owned business. Is traditionally the tenure of people who work within a family business at kind of senior management level is much longer than, say, a PLC, because the PLC is measured against particular revenue targets or shareholder return, etc. And the average stay, I think, is 6 years for executives within non-family-owned businesses. But within a family-owned business, it can be 30, 40 years. Now, that is an advantage, but it can also be a disadvantage, because you get apathy, and you get family business leaders who will say things aren't the same as they were in my day. We need to go back to how it was in the olden days. We now got 15 people in health and safety, whereas before it was all down to me. And yes, but the world's moved on, and part of the challenge, I think, is making sure that the structure around the family business is best suited for mirroring the family's views and ethics and values, whilst also keeping pace with a increasingly changing world that is changing at an increasingly high pace. And again, that can be helped by bringing in certain structures, but it's understanding that those aren't necessarily a brake on behaviour. They can be an enabler. So they can be something that says, okay, let's bring this in to enable the family business to do this or that, whatever the sort of goal may be. But yes, it's certainly a huge positive that you have a much longer term view and vision, and generally a much more positive impact on your community as a result. In some communities, family businesses are kind of the bedrock of it. They're what everyone else gravitates around, because they're such an important part of the community.
Yeah, that's really relevant. Yeah, but I was interested in you say that resistance to change, and I had that very much from my dad, who came into the business with a lot of experience. But as I found my feet, I wanted to do things that I see was actually good for the business and ensures our longevity. And those basically were around technology. And my dad had no experience and was quite, I suppose, scared of technology and didn't really want to do it unless he was sure that it was going to be worthwhile. And that was one of my biggest challenges, was to bring in the scanning systems that are, as we see in retail environments now, are norm. And also with the accounting system, I could see that that's what we needed to do, just get a bit more efficient. But that was a big challenge. And when we pressed the button, it was pretty much me having to make sure that this was actually going to work. The pressure that goes with it, because you do get those sort of vibes. Well, be it on your head if this doesn't work. But thankfully it was, and it worked out well, and it was definitely the best thing to do at the time.
And I think you touched on a really important emotion there, which is fear. And there can be a fear within family business, that there is a fear of failure, but there can also be a fear of success, what if this is a success and he's shown that he's more relevant than I am? What does that do to my role within the business? Therefore, some of that resistance can be driven through a fear of not being relevant anymore. And then that links again back to purpose, and something I know you're keen on is motivation, and what is it that actually motivates people. And the thing with that is, what I'm sure you will have far more insight on this than I am, but that what we see more and more often is people are not just driven by financial reward. They're driven by purpose. They're driven by something that they can buy into. And again, family businesses are brilliantly placed to be able to articulate their values to get people to buy into those. But what that then means is if you bring somebody in to do a job and then don't allow them to do that, it can be a real sticking point for people to go, well, hang on, I was buying into this vision. I was buying into this dream that you've shared with us, that that's what we want. But you're not allowing me to do that because you're scared of what that might mean for the business. And I think, again, understanding yourself and what drives you is a huge part of effective leadership within any business, but particularly within a family-owned business.
Yeah. And sadly, I mean, I worked with my older brother for a long time, and it's only in the last year that I found out how he's motivated. And it's very different the way I'm motivated. And that's why I'm so sort of passionate about understanding what's driving everyone within the business. And obviously that changes over time. It's just checking in with that and making sure that we're aware of what's driving each one of us. Absolutely. To make sure that it doesn't become a conflict. And that's I think that's definitely where we could have used the information to understand each other better, and understand where we're coming from. Yeah. So,
one other thing on that, just quickly, sorry, is we use a concept called mental maps when we're working with families. Now, what it effectively is based on, so say you and your brother are sat in a room together and you are facing each other on a table. If you were both asked to describe that room, you would give very different readings of what was in that room, because you would describe what's behind your brother would describe what's behind you. But the fact of the matter is you're sat in the same room at the same time and being asked to do the same thing. And that's something that, again, ties in with that motivation thing. There's no right or wrong. It's just understanding other people's view of the world and understanding what your own view of the world is, and understanding they're different, irrespective of the fact that you may have very, very similar upbringings. You're only ever going to see things through your own lens, and your brother would only ever see things through his lens. And so that understanding that as well can be a big part of helping to oil the wheels of communication, shall we say, in those potentially tricky conversations.
Yeah. And what I understand more about what he was driven by, he's more commercial than me, and I'm more about making a difference. So really, the two different direction we were heading was that I wanted to be more specialist, whereas he wanted to be more generalist and expand, to more stores. But there was always a resistance within me, which I didn't really understand, but I understand what that is now, which would have been really useful at the time. Sadly, Russ, we're running out of time rapidly, and it's been a fascinating conversation, even for someone that's been in a family business and know what it feels like. It's really useful, I think, for anybody to understand how this, the dynamics work, whether you are potentially going to be working for a family business, or you have family businesses in your network, and maybe you can think about them slightly differently, and that you need to sort of approach things slightly differently, maybe. But before we wrap up, I always ask my guests to give us some 3 top tips that we can take away. So I think that's the time now for you to leave us with 3 bits of wisdom that we can remember.
If I know 3 bits of wisdom. So my first one is possibly an obvious one, but it is to communicate. And it's a very simple word, but it's not an easy thing to do. But if you can get it right, then it can pay huge dividends. So communicate is the first one. Second one would be to plan early. So as I say, the best time for planning succession is probably a long time ago. The second best time is now. The third one is to embrace emotion and understand that everybody is an emotional creature. As humans, we are emotional creatures, and we all all share hopes, fears, aspirations, and being able to articulate and talk about those and create that safe environment to do so can help remove some of the challenges that families often face when they're working together. So those would be my 3 top tips.
Brilliant stuff. Thank you, Russ. I much appreciate your time today. I've really enjoyed it, and hopefully we will catch up in real life sometime. But in the meantime, have a great day.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, please take a moment to leave a review. Don't forget to check out the Reluctant Leader project at www.thereluctantleader.co.uk. Make a note to start, stop, or continue doing whatever struck a chord in this episode. And until next time, be the best you can be.